All right, good afternoon. We're delighted to be joined by Ninette Kelley, who's the head of the UNHCR's office here in New York, and she will brief you on the Global Trends Report by UNHCR, which was released today.
Thank you.
Yes, you are.
Yes, thank you very much. And it's nice to see everybody again. But of course, it's also a bit depressing because I'm here to report on our global trends, which is our global trends of forced displacement for 2018. And sadly, again this year, we've seen a disappointing trend in terms of an increase in forced displacement. The global number now is well over 70 million. And quite frankly, I always struggle to be able to convey exactly what that number means. And when you look at the number as a whole, it's equivalent to the size of the population of France or the population of Thailand. It's in fact twice the population of my own country, Canada. There's a really great saying. It says, the death of a single person is a tragedy. The death of a million is a statistic. And I think we can all relate to that. So only thing I can say to you before we go into the highlights of the report is to try to encourage you to think of every number as representing a single human being that's undergone extreme difficulty. Often every refugee I've ever met has told me that leaving home was the last desperate act after a series of huge hardships. So I think that's really important to keep in mind. In terms of that global number, the 70 million, 41 million are persons who've had to flee their home area and go somewhere else in their own country in order to seek safety and security. And I have to say that often is not stable either, because they often have to move several times within their own country. And if you imagine the situation in Syria right now in the northwest, and the movement of over 300,000 people recently in Syria, these can be multiple displacements, as has been the case in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which in recent weeks has seen over 300,000 people been displaced from one area of the country into another. So the leading countries of internally displaced persons remain Colombia, Syria, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Now, the other large group is over 26 million refugees. These are people who've left their country and sought safety in another country. 26 million is the largest number that UNHCR has recorded in its nearly 70-year existence. And sadly, I'm here to say once again that over two-thirds of those refugees come from primarily 5 countries. They come from Syria, Afghanistan, South Sudan, Myanmar, and Somalia. And when you reflect on those countries for a moment, you will also appreciate that 2 of them, Afghanistan and Somalia, have seen successive waves of displacement for over 40 years. And it's probably trite to say, but if we could find a solution in terms of sustaining peace and mitigation of conflict in just 1 or 2 of those countries, we would see the number of refugees decline dramatically. The other statistic that comes to the fore in this report is that over half the population of forcibly displaced are children. And this is a statistic that's repeated after year and is actually an extremely tragic one, because it doesn't just represent a child who's had to flee home once and then establish themselves and their family in another place, but often go somewhere where their circumstances are extremely difficult, much less than they had at home. If you look at education, it's a good indicator for this. Globally, 90% of primary school-age children are in school, and yet within the refugee population, that's less than 50%. And that represents a huge obstacle in terms of future potential and ability, lost dreams, lost potential. We see so many sad cases of child refugees having to work as children, of young girl refugees being contracted into marriage at a younger age, not to mention incidents of sexual exploitation and abuse. So this is a very sad and telling reminder of what are the very egregious effects of the conflict and the persecution that persist in the world today. And again, I'm here to tell you, as I did last year, but sadly it repeated itself again in 2018, is that we know over 100,000 children fled to safety without their parents or without their legal guardian. We don't usually let our children go to school unaccompanied, let alone cross an international boundary. But this has been the plight of over 100,000 children that we know of. And in some cases, we have documented, for example, in Uganda, over 5,000 children or several thousand children arriving who were without their parents less than 5 years old. So these are rather searing statistics to keep in mind when we're looking at our global trends. The other common element from previous years is that most refugees, they're not fleeing to the developed world or to Western countries, but in fact they have sought safety, they've looked for security, assistance in neighboring countries. And that means that over 2/3 of the refugee population are hosted in the developing world and among the least developed countries. Turkey has 3.6 million refugees, mostly from Syria. Pakistan has hosted millions of Afghan refugees for many decades. It's now over 1.7 million Afghan refugees. Iran as well. We see Uganda, who is among the least developed countries, which has over 1 million refugees, and Bangladesh, which not only is among the least developed countries, but is also has one of the highest population densities in the world, is doing heroic efforts to try to provide safety and security to over 1 million Rohingya refugees who have fled from Myanmar. The other, I think, worrying developments in 2018 that we saw were new patterns of displacement. We saw over 1 million persons displaced due to intercommunal violence in Ethiopia. Ethiopia is a country which is one of the leading host countries for refugees in Africa, who has considerable challenges to meet the development needs for its own population, has a very progressive policies towards refugees, and yet has also experienced this wave of internal displacement. And of course, Venezuela, which you all know, the figures from Venezuela now, the countries in the region who have registered Venezuelans who have fled Venezuela since 2015 is now over 4 million persons. So these are some of the general trends. I would just say the other sad statistic this year is that the ability for people to return home, to start up lives again back home, continues to be diminished. We saw 3 million people return home, but this was last year, but this was far outstripped by the 13 million people that were newly displaced. And often return was to situations that were unstable and not conducive to sustainable life and future prospects. An illustration of that is Syria, where we saw over 600,000 refugees return back to Syria. Yet in the same period of time, we saw over 800,000 refugees flee the country. So it speaks to the difficulties we have in terms of seeing a future that is more stable for refugees back home, which gets back to what the Secretary General noted when our Global Trends report was issued today, is that the solution, of course, to forced displacement is not a humanitarian one, but it's a political one. And in that regard, the track record of the global community is a very poor one. But to conclude, because I think it's also important to shed some light on some positive trends that we are in fact seeing. And these trends have been building over years. While we have seen a negative trend in terms of addressing the causes of forced displacement, we have seen more innovative, sustainable responses to it. And that culminated last year with, I think, as you might have covered, all of you here in the UN, the General Assembly's affirmation of a global compact on refugees, which recognized a number of important developments for the future. One is that providing assistance to refugees and security to refugees is a global responsibility, and that a disproportionate burden was being shouldered by states who often are the least able to manage that alone. So much more and resolute support needed to go to host communities, to states that were helping refugees, to invest in their infrastructure, in their services, to the betterment of their own populations, but also to the betterment of refugees. And we need to invest in refugee potential as well. It's not just a question of providing humanitarian assistance, but enabling refugees to develop the skills and advance their own capacities so they can contribute to the communities in which they live and eventually the communities to which they return when peace and stability is restored. And this global compact, there have been a number of very positive developments around the world, which will be showcased in December at a global forum on refugees in Geneva that UNHCR is convening, which will be an opportunity for countries, but as well other stakeholders that have come on board very resolutely in this regard, development actors, municipalities, civil society organizations, refugees, to talk about what they have advanced and what kind of pledges and commitments they're making for the future to make this the promise of the global compact a reality. And with that, I think I'll stop, Steph, to take on any
Evelyn?
questions.
Welcome, Evelyn Leopold. Welcome on behalf of the UN Correspondents Association. Does any country allow refugees to work, to build a career, not just drive taxis, but teach or whatever their abilities are?
No.
It'll go by itself.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, indeed they do. And what's too bad is that those countries often they don't get the visibility they need. In fact, I often start a presentation by giving an example of one of the least developed countries that receives a million refugees, and I ask students, do you think they're a country in the world that allows them to have land and access to livelihoods and access to services? And every student in the room will say no, and yet, in fact, Uganda does. Or Ethiopia has passed very progressive laws. If you look at Pakistan, we've worked in partnership with Pakistan to increase livelihoods of refugees in Pakistan and access to health and education services. You look at Iran, where children, documented and undocumented refugees, have access to education and health insurance. So indeed, there are many positive developments around the world that showcase. And what's very telling about these examples is they often come from the countries that are struggling to meet the needs of their own population, and which really do stand as a beacon to the rest of the world as to what is possible.
Mr. Sato? Thank you. It's on.
Thank you for your briefing. I'm Sato from Japan TV NHK. About Venezuela, like you mentioned, that the number of displaced persons is already 4 million, and some projection said over 5 million at the end of the year. What is the UN's the most challenge to deal with the refugee from Venezuela?
Well, first and foremost, the biggest challenge, of course, is to the people that are fleeing. And I recently was able to stand at the border of Colombia and see how they were crossing. And it was a very sad and moving experience. They're not coming with moving. They're coming from a country where they had jobs and education and all the rest, but they're not coming with moving vans. They're coming with plastic bags of their belongings, with children and sick and elderly, and they're traversing a continent on foot in very adverse circumstances. And it is very challenging for the countries in the region who have shown incredible solidarity. Right now, Colombia, I think, is over 1.3 million Venezuelans they have accepted into their country. Peru now has over 800,000. But it's a challenge for them because for two reasons. One is that their asylum systems themselves were not built to anticipate this kind of an influx. And creatively, they've provided a lot of alternative forms of status for Venezuelans who've come over, but there's still many who are undocumented. So it's knowing who the population is, being able to register them. But as well, it creates an impact on their social services because Venezuelans are coming and the children need education and they're sick and they need services, and it's creating a great pressure on these services. Unfortunately, our international appeal for support is just 30% funded. So what we're saying is the international community needs to come in and resolutely support these countries, which have taken a very generous and a regional approach to be able to cope with not just the current numbers that are in their countries, but anticipated ones that may follow should the situation in Venezuela not stabilize in the coming months.
Betty, and then Joe, then Stefano.
Thank you. With the developing situation on the U.S. southern border, you mentioned that out of the 70 million displaced people, there is 100,000 unaccompanied children. Do you have any indication how many unaccompanied children are on the U.S. southern border or they are in the process in the asylum system into the U.S.?
No, that kind of forensic detail, it's not within my purview, but, it would be, I'm not sure if that information is available to UNHCR, but we could definitely look into it and follow up subsequently.
Joe?
Yeah, Joseph Klein, Canada Free Press. I'd like to ask for some clarification, if you may, on the criteria for refugee status in the UNHCR versus UNRWA. But with respect to the UNHCR, two related issues is, number one, if a refugee becomes a citizen in a host country, a destination country, under your criteria, would that person no longer be considered a refugee? And secondly, it's often been cited that your agency helps the children of Afghanistan refugees in Pakistan, provides services to children and so forth. But under your agency's criteria, would those children or their children's children be automatically registered as refugees? Or is this handled on a case-by-case basis and a service support basis? Thank you.
In some sense, your two questions are rather related, because a refugee is defined as a person who's outside his or her country and who has a well-founded fear of persecution and is unable to avail themselves of the protection of their own country. Well, once a refugee becomes a citizen of another country, then they're no longer a refugee. So they go off our books. So that's the response to there. Now, many children who are refugee children are actually born in exile. So their parents have fled, and they're born there, but they don't have a claim to citizenship in the country that they're in. They remain citizens of the country of their parental birth. So they are considered refugees, and they would be noted within our statistics.
But is this status handed down from generation to generation, even if, let's say, grandchildren or great-grandchildren have the capability of being resettled in the destination country and are not subject to persecution in the destination country?
Well, there's two issues there. One is you're only a refugee if you have a well-founded persecution in your country of citizenship. As long as that condition exists, then you're a refugee. If you've received citizenship in another country and you're safe in that country, you're no longer a refugee. So it's not a question of whether this transfers to generation, it's whether the circumstances that you're in leave you without the protection of your country.
Stefano, and then Masoud.
Yes, Stefano Vaccara, La Voce di New York and Radio Radicale in Rome. I would like to understand better how the UNHCR established when somebody is a refugee and instead is not, he's a migrant. In the case of Venezuela, and for what I understand, also from this last report, not all the Venezuelans applied for refugee status. Many did, more didn't. But the UN recognized that those Venezuelans fleeing the country should be considered refugees. Well, why somebody, let's say, fleeing from Eritrea, going not through walking through South America, but maybe going through the desert, a mother with children, then arrives to Libya, and then maybe she's able to get on a boat. Then she's pushed back because she say, no, you are not a refugee, you are a migrant. So why there is this difference in understanding who is refugee, should be protected as a refugee? And in this, I want to just say, this is a personal opinion, I think a migrant should have the same rights, almost. Should not be left to die on the sea.
Well, let me start by fully agreeing with you. And migrants, like refugees, do have human rights that need to be protected. What makes a refugee slightly different, and it goes back to my response to the previous question, it's a person who is outside their own country, and this is defined by international law, as well as by regional instruments, for example, of what you have in the Americas, the Cartagena Declaration. They're outside their own country, and they have a well-founded fear of persecution, and they're unable to their country is unable to protect them. That is the crux of it. So there are many migrants who need protection in the sense of they should not be trafficked. They should be treated humanely, but who are able to go back to their country. They're not facing persecution. What makes the refugee experience different is that they no longer can claim the security of their own country.
I have a quick follow-up, because I say a country, for example, Eritrea, not just because Venezuela today's situation, if I understand, is a bad situation, and I would not like to be living there at the moment. But it doesn't look like that a Venezuelan leaves Venezuela in this moment because the government is entering their home to kill them or to arrest them, but they leave because the situation is becoming unbearable. No health care, nothing, okay? Well, it's not, in the situation of Eritrea, it looks like that the people leaving because a lot of human rights are not respected, and if you risk to die just because maybe you express your. So why often happens that instead people that consider migrants when they actually leave a situation that even worse, I would say, than what's happening today in Venezuela?
Well, I think it's an excellent question, and I fully appreciate where you're coming from in terms of how to understand that dynamic. A person can be in need of international protection, not just because they are fleeing their government, not because they flee persecution of their own state, but they can be at risk from a lot of other forces. And in Latin America, there is the Cartagena Declaration, which recognizes that international protection should be afforded to those who face personal persecution and violence and don't have the protection of their country, or in situations where there has been a disillusion of public order such that you can't get health care or services. And we're seeing that more and more in the Venezuela situation, which is why, in our view, these are persons in need of international protection. Having said that, does that mean they need to get refugee status, or they can get, we're encouraging states to give them a protected status. Some states have chosen to give them temporary permits, migration status, refugee status. What's important to us is they are being able to be provided with security and assistance, and that their need for protection is recognized. The exact form of that becomes less important so long as the principle itself is in place.
Masood, and then we'll
Thank you.
leave the floor to Monica.
My name is Masood. I'm from Dawn newspaper of Pakistan. I just want to know, Pakistan at one point in time hosted as many as 5 million Afghan refugees at the height of the war. And now the population has come down to 1 million. But all these refugees are now assimilating in the society, but some are not. And the Pakistan government has to bear expense of this. How does the international community, can the international community somehow mitigate the costs that the Pakistan government is now bearing?
Well, it has over many decades helped to mitigate. Many hundreds of millions of dollars have gone into assistance, not just humanitarian assistance into Pakistan, but also, and more in recent years, development assistance to help strengthen institutions inside Pakistan, the delivery of services that will benefit not just refugees, but also Pakistani nationals as well. But it is true that Pakistan has assumed this huge responsibility. The situation in Afghanistan is still one in flux, where we're seeing it as, again, a leading producer of refugees. And so the whole idea behind the Global Compact is to ensure that countries like Pakistan are able to call more resolutely and more on other states to support them in the work that they do.
Great. Thank you very much. Please stay for Monica's briefing. And Ninette, thank you very much. And we'll see you before next year.